Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris. Before I get started, I want to say a big thank you to all the Politia and MCE folks. You guys have put together a fantastic conference so far. Really enjoyed working with you guys, so thank you to you guys. This has been amazing. So as Chris said, my name is Kevin Rohling. I'm going to talk about Agile tools and practices for mobile today. Before I get started, I just want to show you guys what time it is on my laptop. I don't know if you can see that, it's cut off. It's like 3 a.m. in San Francisco right now. So I'm a little bit out of it. I'm basically just running on coffee. So I'm just gonna set that expectation for you guys right now. All right, cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. A little bit about me. As Chris mentioned, I founded a company called CI Simple. Got acquired by Electric Cloud last year. It's now called Ship.io. It's basically a CI system for mobile. So in building this thing, I ended up learning a lot about the practices that lots of different companies use for doing Agile for their mobile products. I'm also a coder, so I've built apps. I've shipped apps on iOS, Android, even Windows Phone, and I didn't code this BlackBerry app, but I was part of the product development for BlackBerry app once. Are there any BlackBerry developers out there today? Nope. Does anybody know a BlackBerry developer? No. Do you really? Seriously? All right, cool. It's like 2 degrees to a BlackBerry developer here. Cool. And I like to hack on hardware things. I'm currently VP of product at Emberlight. My co-founder Steve down here in the bottom. He's our chief design officer. What is Emberlight, you ask? I'm sure you're all asking that. It's a smart socket. It's a smart lighting product. We're taking pre-orders up on our website. Feel free to go buy 10 of them right now. So moving on. So what does Agile mean? I'm not a big fan of buzzwords, and Agile is probably one. And it's used a lot to mean different things to different people. But basically, what does Agile mean to me? It basically means that you're moving quickly, or you're moving fast, and you're adapting quickly. So that means a couple of different things in software. You're releasing as much as you possibly can, but then also you're getting feedback on your software as quick as you possibly can too, so that you can make changes to the software so that the next version that you ship, because you're going to be shipping again very soon, has updates and things that you've learned from your previous builds integrated into them. So what does this process typically look like? There's typically a build, test, release process. Then there's some data collection process, which if it's post-production, that usually means some form of analytics. If it's pre-production, that's usually some sort of testing, either automated or with human beings. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. Just so I kind of know, how many of you guys are mobile developers out there? Wow. I guess this is a mobile conference, so I shouldn't be surprised. That is a lot of mobile developers. I don't know if I've ever talked to that many mobile developers at once. So I think one of the other important things to be agile, if you will, means that you're always ready to ship your code. You've always got some build that you can ship that's got something new in it, some bug fix, something. Facebook has just started releasing their app very quickly, so they're shipping about every 2 weeks. Any of you guys ship new versions of your app every 2 weeks? No. You, Chris, you do? Yeah. Not a lot of people are moving that fast. It's pretty impressive being able to ship that quickly, especially inside of an organization the size of Facebook. I've seen small companies that can't ship that fast, so that's pretty impressive. So one of the things that I learned fairly quickly at CI Simple is that one size does not fit all when it comes to agile or engineering practices. Different sizes of companies and different types of companies, they have very different needs, and so that dramatically impacts the kind of practices that they need to follow with their engineering. So just to give you guys a couple of examples. So Emberlight is a very early stage startup. We're working on getting initial traction. We're also working on raising money. So some of the things that are really important to us are stability and user experience. When we take our app to investors, and we're showing this to people, or customers or press, we need this thing to be relatively stable so that it doesn't crash, but we also need to have just a sick user experience because we're trying to raise money, we're trying to impress people. We don't have what you might refer to as cash, so we're kind of like fighting to stay alive. Consulting firms, on the other hand, they've got very different needs. They've got, they're not struggling to stay alive. They're not struggling for cash. They're not raising money necessarily. But they've got clients that are always wanting to know what's going on with the projects. Are you guys consulting or product? How many of you guys are consulting firms? No? Not very many. A lot of product folks out there. Okay. Cool. Yeah, it's actually really, really cool to hear. So consulting firms, very, very different drivers for the engineering. Like I said, client status updates. So some of the things that are really important to keep clients happy is you need to be able to send out ad hoc builds of their product as quickly as you possibly can so that they know that work is happening. Also, unit testing is fairly important. For larger product teams, it's a little bit different. If you're in a big company, this is maybe like a Facebook description here. You already have a product. You've already got something in the market. Your drivers on the business side are going to be things like user retention. It's going to be growth. You're trying to get more users on your platform. It's going to be revenue. What changes can I make to my product to increase revenue? So the things that you're learning through this cycle, this build, test, release, go through this whole cycle again, the things that you're learning, the data that you're collecting is going to be things like how many people am I signing up on a regular basis? What are my conversion rates through different screens, that sort of thing. So the feedback loop is a little bit different depending upon what kind of company you're working with. So I think that's really important to keep in mind when you're talking about these things. There is no one size fits all. There is no one practice that works for every single company. I wish I could get up here and just tell you guys exactly how to, architect your engineering and your agile processes, but it's very, very different for different companies. Another thing I always want to say about being agile is that mobile is just frankly harder. Do you guys also have web development in your shops? I would imagine most of you probably do. Most mobile apps these days have some web component behind it. It's probably some sort of API. Testing something that is on the web is not terribly difficult. Worst case, you get pushed to Heroku or something, put it up on EC2, whatever your platform happens to be, and you can go out and you can go play with it immediately. You can send links to people and they can play around with it. Super easy. Mobile is just frankly harder. Testing, for example, there's this whole dichotomy. Do I use simulators for doing my automated testing? Do I do real devices? That's an open question for some people. We've got app stores that we have to deal with, and let's be honest, getting something through the Apple App Store is really just kind of a painful process. It's a couple of weeks, and you have all these forms that you have to fill out and screenshots to upload. That's like many hours of my life that I'll never get back. And then code signing. If you're going to put this thing on a device and test it, you've got to go through this whole code signing process. Not terrible on not terrible on Android, but let's be honest. Is there anybody who really feels like they really, really understand code signing and provisioning profiles on iOS? There's some really smart people here. It's complicated, man. It's complicated. I feel like I just figured it out yesterday. And then there's distribution. So now that you've got this build and you've got it code signed and everything, it's how do you get it to people? It's a little bit of a trick too. So I'm going to talk about a few different processes and a few different tools for these various ways of being agile with mobile. So I'll talk a little bit about human-based testing. I'll talk a little bit about different testing tools. I'll talk about continuous integration. And so I'll start with human-based testing. I think everybody does some sort of human-based testing. This is basically a human being. You've got an app on a device. You've got some human being playing with it, trying to find bugs. Some of the really cool advantages of this is that you can get fairly fast, detailed feedback if you have the right kind of testers. You can avoid disrupting your actual users by having somebody else playing with your app on a device. And real people do the darndest things. So one thing I want to be perfectly clear about when it comes to your human-based testing, your engineers don't count. If your engineers are the guys who are doing your testing, you're not really testing. Engineers are awesome at engineering things, but they're really bad at finding bugs, especially in their own code. I'm not sure exactly why that is, and I know I've been really bad about finding bugs in my own code, but it's something I've noticed with most engineers. Not very good at finding bugs in their own code. So, I mean, there's a couple of different ways that you can go about getting other people to test it, which I'll talk about in a minute. So some of the challenges with having human beings test your application for you. One I talked about is distribution. How do you actually get it out to them? If you want a large group of people who are testing your app for you, you kind of have to curate that group somehow, and you've got to get your app to them. It's also getting quality feedback from people can be really challenging. If you've ever tried to set up like a Google group and just get people to come and say, hey, I'll test your app, and then you send it to them, like you'll get a very vocal minority of people who are maybe a little bit ranty. So you've really got to like kind of curate your feedback a little bit, and just so getting lots of high quality feedback is really challenging from human beings. And there's a bit of a latency involved as well. So when you send this out to people, hopefully they're testing it for you right away, but chances are they're going to test it when they get home and they're bored and there's not really anything good on TV. So there's a few different strategies for your human testing. The cheapest of which is getting your friends and family to do it, which is actually a really good strategy if you're kind of strapped for cash. Friends and family are typically normal people, not like us engineers. So they will do crazy things to your app for you. And they're typically usually very easy to get a hold of, and it's fairly easy to get a hold of their phones. And they're willing to put something on their phone, and they don't necessarily know if it's any good or not. You can get a curated group of testers. This is kind of what I mentioned about getting like a Google group, that sort of thing. That's a little bit more work because then you've got to set up the group. You've got to kind of curate that group, figure out who you're going to send the builds to out of that group, and then you've got to go and sort through all the feedback that you get from them. There are testing services that you can use as well, which is some of them are kind of nice. And then if you've got lots and lots of cash, you can get an in-house testing team, which those are big companies. I work in little startups, so I've never had the advantage of having an in-house testing team. So I'll talk a little bit about distribution. All right. So I have most of you guys use TestFlight. It's pretty much everybody uses TestFlight, right? If you guys haven't seen this already, testflightapp.com no longer available after the end of this month. Kind of a bummer. I don't know if you guys have tried using the new iTunes Connect version of TestFlight, but you have to go through this approval process with Apple, which having to get your app approved to do a TestFlight distribution completely ruins TestFlight for me. I don't know about you guys, but it's a little bit of a pain. Some of the good things about TestFlight historically is, great iOS support. It was acquired by Apple. Pretty much everybody used this. Whenever I was doing consulting and I worked with a mobile client, they just expected that I was going to be sending them a TestFlight build. Everybody just knows what TestFlight is. Some of the downsides is, if you're a cross-platform shop, which most people I think are cross-platform these days, TestFlight only supports iOS. And in my opinion, I think the UX around it is just it's a little mediocre. Could be better. On the other hand, have any of you guys tried Hockey App? If you used Hockey App, just raise your hand real quick. Any Hockey App users? Yeah, they were just bought by Microsoft. Hopefully nothing bad happens now that they've been acquired by Microsoft. But this is a really good solution. It's cross-platform, works for iOS and Android. They've got a really good API, much better than TestFlight's ever was. Really good UX. you do still have to deal with this whole UDID provisioning profile nightmare, which obviously that's the advantage of using the iTunes Connect version of TestFlight is you don't have to deal with the UDIDs and the provisioning profiles. But now that TestFlight, I'll be honest, now that TestFlight app is shutting down and I don't want to deal with the approval process on Apple, I'm going to be using Hockey app all the time, and I promise they did not pay me anything to say that. And then finally, if you're on Android, they've got this really neat alpha beta program, and you can do really cool stuff like staged rollouts. You can send your builds to just a small percentage of your actual users. So what's really cool about that is if you want feedback from people, ideally you want it to be your actual users, but you don't want to disrupt your whole user base. So this is really cool. So you can send your builds out to just a small section of your user base. So you're not disrupting everybody. And then you can get feedback from those people and then go through that iteration process. And then when you feel solid about it, you roll it out to everybody. So that's a really cool feature. One of the downsides of this feature, however, is that it actually can result in negative app reviews. So they can review your app as a beta build, and it will show up as an actual app review. So it can hurt your app reviews if you're giving these guys not very stable beta builds, and then they go and leave an app review. Hopefully, most people are not going to do that sort of thing, but it is Android, so who knows? It would be really cool if the Apple App Store had something like that. Cool. So I'll talk a little bit about crowd testing. So Applause is a really cool crowd testing service. They've got this really massively curated audience of people globally. So if you've got kind of a fairly niche audience of people that you want to target in a specific geographic location, they can typically help you get those people. So you can filter it down based on all sorts of demographics, based on geographic location, and they can help you get the audience that you want to do testing. And they'll send it out to a whole bunch of people, and you'll actually start getting feedback pretty quickly. They're a little expensive. That is kind of the downside with this kind of service. They're very enterprisey to work with, but it's a really good service. If you happen to work in a company that has money, then this is an option for you guys. Another good one is user testing. These guys are really cool. They do a video recording. Now, I think the value of an actual video recording for somebody using your app is maybe a little bit debatable. It's really cool the first couple of times you use it, but then video is kind of a really difficult thing to grok in large quantity. But it starts at like $50 American, so it's not it's pretty inexpensive. It's actually a cheaper way to get other people testing your app without having to go out and find testers yourself. And then there's this thing right here. So this is really cool. This is an actual website. I like to be a tester for this. You guys should check that out tonight. Testing tools. So I'll talk a little bit about testing tools for mobile. Before I do, another question for you guys. How many of you guys are Android developers? Okay, that's cool. That's a lot of you guys. How many of you guys are iOS developers? All right, and now leave your hand up if you're both. Okay, cool. It's about 10 people that are both. That's pretty cool. Cool. So I'm going to talk about unit and functional testing. So first of all, what's the difference between these two things? Unit testing is typically when you're testing a small block of code. So unit test isn't necessarily interacting directly with your UI. You've got some class in your code, or you've got some methods in your code that you want to do some testing on. So you want to specify what the inputs are to that code and what the expected outputs are to that code. So you'll typically write unit tests for that. Functional testing, on the other hand, this is testing at the UI level. So when you're writing functional tests, you're telling your app to say, click this button, like click this text field, fill in this user ID, click this other text field, put in a password, click this button. So you're actually, these are kind of nice because then you're working at a UI level and you can work through a bunch of different flows for your app. So those are really nice. Some of the benefits of unit and functional testing are that you get instant gratification. So you can run these. They're automated, so you can run unit and functional tests, write in Xcode or whatever your IDE of choice happens to be, and you can find out really quickly if the code that you wrote is actually working. So green is good, red is bad. These are repeatable, so you check these into source code, and then your other developers, they can pull the tests down, they can run them as well. And if you're using some sort of CI service, you can automatically run these tests on every single commit. So that's really powerful. We'll talk a little bit about CI in just a bit, but the idea of testing every single commit that goes into your app is actually really powerful. And then some of the challenges with unit tests, because they're not a panacea, there are definitely challenges with working with them. So unit tests are not your users. So that means that for every possible thing that a user could do in your app, you may have to write a test for it. Now, I'm not advocating that you try and write a test for every single thing that a user can do in your app. That's just ridiculous. But the point is if you do want to replicate some user behavior, you've got to go in and write a test for it. And that's a non-trivial amount of work. I think people somewhat trivialize the amount of work of writing tests sometimes, but it is a significant amount of work. And then there's the maintenance on tests. So if you are ever going to refactor anything in your app, you are also going to have to refactor your tests. And so that's maybe not doubling the amount of work, but it's definitely adding a pretty good chunk of work onto it. And then you've got this whole question of which framework to use. I've seen companies who are they've got some mandate that they need to start doing unit testing, and they spend a month just trying to figure out which testing framework they want to use, because there's so many options out there, and it's really, really hard to get guidance and figure out which one you should actually use. So I will talk a little bit about testing frameworks in just a minute. So when it comes to testing frameworks, which one should you be using? Which language/frameworks do your developers know is typically the first question that I ask. So if your developers are really good Objective-C developers, then maybe find a testing framework that you can write in Objective-C. There are some companies and they've got dedicated testers, people who their job is dedicated to writing tests, which doesn't sound like a very fun job to me. But some companies have these people, and not all of them are really good coders. Some of them they're really good testers, but they need to write some code so they can do automated tests. And so there's some frameworks that use JavaScript that have been really worked out really well, like UI automation on iOS. I've worked with some companies that they had these testers that they were kind of okay at testing, but you gave them some JavaScript and they could just fly and write tests all day. And then there's some of these testing frameworks, some of them have some baggage. So some of them have some requirements and some gotchas when you go and integrate them into your app that you kind of have to watch out for. So that's really important to know if you're integrating one of these into your app. So let me talk a little bit about these different testing tools. So XC Test, I'll just start off with this one. This is baked into Xcode. It's got some really cool stuff. Prior to XC Test, there was this thing called OC Unit, which was okay. It was not great. But the really cool thing about it, it was baked into Xcode. XC Test is pretty freaking good. It's baked into Xcode, like I said. One of the things that really kind of blew my mind a little bit when I started getting into XC Test is how easy it was to do async testing. So this is just a snapshot of a project that I worked on, where I was writing a test for an API call, and this is an asynchronous method. And so going into this, I'd never done this before. And so I was a little bit worried. I'm like, how am I going to test this? Am I going to have to do a whole bunch of hacking to make this work synchronously? Fortunately, there's some really cool stuff built right into XC Test. It's called expectations that let you do asynchronous method testing incredibly easy. So I was really impressed. I would love to hear if anybody has anything bad to say about XC Test. Does anybody have anything bad to say about XC Test? It's totally cool. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I didn't write it. Yeah, what's up? No data-driven tests? Okay. What do you mean by data-driven tests?
Well, in other frameworks and languages, it's possible
Okay. All right. Cool. That's fair. All right. Cool. Another one is UI automation. So this is a functional UI testing framework. One of the really cool things about UI automation is built right into instruments. There's this kind of nifty test recorder. So you can actually generate UI automation tests just by clicking around in the UI on a simulator or a device. So that's actually pretty cool. If you have folks who are not necessarily developers that need to be making tests, that's a really cool way of doing it. One of the least, I guess one of the challenges with UI automation is it is part of instruments, which is a little bit challenging to use. And it uses JavaScript, which is probably cool for some folks. It's a little bit, I don't know. I think it's always better if you can have your developers writing tests in the same language that they're writing their code in. That's one of the bigger complaints that I've heard from people who are using new frameworks. So not a big fan of the fact that it's JavaScript, but for some folks, that's maybe a plus. Also, there's this thing called KIF, which this is an open source framework. It's functional UI level testing. The whole driver behind building KIF was to build a testing framework that focused on being really easy to use. And they did a really good job. This was before XC test came out. But KIF is still really good. However, the downside to KIF is that it does require integrating a third-party framework. And you have to make sure that you set it up correctly when you pull it into your project, because it does call private APIs. And so you have to make sure that that doesn't end up in your production build, because it could get your app rejected. But it's pretty easy to set up in such a way that that doesn't happen. But it's just one other caveat that you have to know when you're pulling these things in is if you do it wrong, you could end up getting your app rejected from the App Store, which is not a good thing. So now I'll talk a little bit about Android testing tools. So there's a recent survey by Xamarin, which Xamarin they're a cross-platform development tool. So it lets you write C#, runs on iOS, runs on Android. I'm not going to talk too much about cross-platform development tools, but they did this really cool survey where they asked a whole bunch of mobile developers about their testing practices. And it turns out that 77% of developers said that app quality is very important or mission critical. And 80% of mobile developers, however, they test their apps manually, and only 13% are actually building automated tests. So 77% said that app quality is, very, very important or mission critical, but only 13% were actually writing automated tests. That's just like a huge, huge difference there. I'm very pragmatic about how much testing you should do, but that's a really big gap. So maybe there should be more automated tests. A little bit about Android testing. JUnit is really nice. This is almost like the XC test of the Android world. Baked right into Android and Eclipse, also Android Studio. Downside is that running tests are very slow. And that's really more of a symptom of the fact that the emulators on Android are really, really slow. Robotium, this is a functional UI testing framework for Android. It's a third-party framework, and running tests is also slow on Robotium as well. One framework that I think is really neat on Android is called Roboelectric. Have any of you guys tried this? It's pretty cool. What Roboelectric will do is it'll mock out a lot of the Android APIs. And so you don't have to start up an emulator, because those emulators are just terribly slow, like god-awful slow. So this lets you run your tests really fast. My experience with it has been a little bit flaky. And the fact that it's mocking out the Android APIs has been a little bit of a challenge, because some things don't work as expected. But in general, it's pretty good. It makes your tests go fast, which is cool. And then the final testing tools thing I want to talk about is just cross-platform. So I talked about iOS. Sorry. I talked about iOS. I talked about Android. I'll talk a little bit about cross-platform tools that work for both. So Appium, if you guys have ever used Selenium for web testing, Appium is it's built by Sauce Labs, which is basically, it's the Selenium guys. And so it works very much the same way that Selenium works, only on a mobile device. So this is really cool. One of the really cool things about this is if you have a team of people that know how to use Selenium, they're going to figure out Appium really fast because it's just so similar. So that's actually a really big advantage. One of the downsides is what you have to bring into your app in order to make this work. It basically spins up a web server. So it's a little bit of a heavy framework. But there's some pretty big advantages. Appium is quickly becoming a very popular testing language. And then there's Calabash. This is pretty neat. It uses the Cucumber syntax. These guys got acquired by Xamarin actually a couple of years ago, and I don't hear about too many people using Calabash anymore these days. I haven't seen a whole lot of recent development on Calabash, but it's pretty neat. So I want to make sure I have time for questions here at the end. But I'm gonna go through this section on continuous integration really quick. So just a real quick introduction to what continuous integration actually is. This is basically a process of automatically building and testing and deploying every commit. And so how does this work? Your developer commits some code up to your Git repository or wherever. The CI server picks up the code change. Next step is that the code is automatically compiled, so you create some sort of build. You'll run tests on either simulators or real devices, and then the application is deployed, potentially pushed out to TestFlight or Hockey App, or maybe automatically uploaded to the App Store. Continuous integration, why use continuous integration? It reduces the need for human-based testing. So if you can have your automated tests run against every commit, it's not going to replace the need for human beings. I think that there is always a place for human being testing with every mobile app. But if you can reduce that, then that's a good thing. And having a CI server that's kind of constantly running your unit tests is actually pretty powerful. I think it can reduce the need for human-based testing, not eliminate it, but reduce it. You can get faster feedback. The fact that this is completely automated, running in the background against every single commit is pretty powerful. You're going to get an email every time something breaks. So that's a very easy way to get quick feedback. And you can just automate as much as you can possibly automate. So I'll tell you a story about a really bad experience that we had that ended up driving me down this direction of continuous integration. I was working at a company, and we had builds on iOS. We had builds on Android. This is where we had the BlackBerry app as well. So we had iOS, Android, and BlackBerry. We had builds of these that were going to the app stores, and we also had builds that were going to some enterprise customers that we had. So we had kind of a configuration nightmare. Every time we did a new release, testing all these different configurations was a complete pain. And all that configuration happened on the developer's desktop. So when we said, hey, we need a build for X client, developer would go into Xcode on their machine, they'd fiddle with some things, and then they would create the build, and we would send that to the client, and they'd put it in their enterprise app store. We accidentally had a build go into the app store that was configured for one of our clients because we kind of misconfigured it. And fortunately we figured this out before anything terrible happened, but it was a little bit of almost a nightmare. And it was really, really clear at that point just how complex this distribution process had become. So what we ended up doing is setting up a CI process. And I highly recommend this, even if you don't have a ridiculously complex distribution process. But just automate your releases. So just have a button that you can click that produces the app that's going to go to the App Store. If you have a button that you can press that creates the build that's going to go to your TestFlight users, just automate as much as you possibly can. The value is that you're much less likely to have human error break one of your builds or misconfigure something or ship something that's pointed at your staging server into production. Not that anybody would actually do that. So when it comes to CI tools, Jenkins is obviously one of the more popular. It's a little bit more challenging to set up, self-hosted. Lots of really nice plugins, though. It's kind of a do-it-yourself solution. Travis CI has become incredibly popular. A nice hosted solution. They have OSX support, a lot of plugins. Setup is a little bit of a pain. Ship.io, I'm obviously a little bit biased here. These guys are pretty good. They're a hosted solution. One of the really cool things about Ship.io is it's designed specifically for mobile. And we've done a lot of work to make the setup process as easy as possible. So there's this scanning that'll happen. It'll automatically scan all your source code and make the setup process as easy as it can possibly be. Because it's kind of geared towards being easy to set up and easy to use, it's a little bit less flexible than some other solutions. So there's some things that you can't necessarily do on Ship.io, but it's meant to be incredibly easy to set up and use. And then there's Xcode CI. So a couple of years ago, Apple put a CI tool. They baked it right into Xcode. So you can get a Mac Mini, you can drop it off in your office, you can set up this Xcode CI server, and you can have your own Xcode CI server running right there in your office. It's kind of nice because it's integrated right with Xcode. It's Apple supported. They don't seem to have done a whole lot of additional work on it since the initial release, but it is pretty nice. Some of the downsides are that it is self-hosted, and then obviously if you're a cross-platform shop, this doesn't do anything for your Android developers. Okay, cool. I have 8 minutes left for questions, so it's right about where I wanted to get at. So do you guys have any questions? No? I'm going to start making up questions for you guys. Let's see.
Apparently,
yeah,
I may have a question.
Yep.
Like in the company that I'm helping, we've got this bi-weekly shipment or a monthly shipment, and as it is quite a short sprint period, we do this what we call quick test to test every build for common usage scenarios. But this is quite boring. So if someone does it more than 5 times, that it's a pain. Do you have any tips and tricks how to manage people to not, kill themselves for doing this for the 50 times a day?
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is that you guys are spending a lot of time doing manual testing on your app. So I mean, there's a certain point where I think you have to say, we're testing this manually every single time. This is something that's it's obviously a really important flow in your app, whatever it happens to be. So there's a threshold where I think you say, we're spending so much time doing manual testing on this thing. Why don't we automate it? So that might be the threshold where you say, why don't we write a unit test or a functional test around this sort of thing? Would that make it easier?
Are there any like human tips and tricks how to manage humans to test more effectively?
How to manage humans? Oh, geez, I don't even know, man. Humans are complicated. So I talked a little bit about crowd services and some different strategies for getting people to test your app. It really depends on the scale and the resources that you have. I mean, if you're a small company like we are and you don't have a whole lot of resources, then friends and family are great. However, if you're a bigger company and you've got more resources, then investing in one of these crowd testing services like Applause or user testing, there's a whole handful of them out there now. That might be a good investment at that point, because it's a trade-off, which is more important for you, money or time. And if you're strapped on time, then maybe you invest the money in one of those resources to basically have them manage all of that for you. Because that's what they do, and that's why they cost a decent amount of money. Because you can just ship them builds, and then they send it out to people, and they aggregate all the feedback, and then they send it to you in a nice report. So they can basically handle all that pain for you. It's really just like a cost-benefit analysis at that point.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Yep.
Yeah, actually, you are working in our company on new applications, and we have 2 QA testers, and they are quite fine on the things they do and how can they broke the application that was written by developers, do a lot of strange things, from, I don't know, flipping the phone on sides, all available sides, inputting wrong data into fields, things that normal people usually don't do. How
normal
about
people
those
do
kind
weird
of
stuff.
tests? How can we automate that? Because we have only 2 people and it's too less, and we require more. Hiring them is not an easy task, because finding good quality QA people it's not easy. Are there any automatic things that we could use to improve in that direction?
Yeah, so it sounds like just to repeat, make sure I understood the challenges. You guys, it sounds like you're a small shop, right? Really? No, not really. Okay. Okay, so just starting to build it, so it sounds like it's a new app, and you've got some fairly complex testing scenarios that you wanna make sure that you can either automate or find some way to reduce the friction for getting feedback on those. Is that because of the nature of your app? Is it like a game, or is there something unique about the app itself that makes you want to make sure you test these things? Okay. Yep. Yeah. Interesting. So there might be ways. So I'll go ahead and say you'll never be able to hit every edge case. You'll never be able to reproduce a human being. Human beings do the weirdest stuff in mobile apps. Like it's amazing. You can have a button that clearly says log out, and somebody might hit it thinking they'll log in with it. Like people do crazy weird stuff with your app, and you'll never be able to completely reproduce a human being. And I don't think you should necessarily try, because you'll just kill yourself writing way too many tests. I think the goal should be to hit like the 80 to 90% case. So there are some ways to test some of these more complex scenarios. There's actually a bunch of testing a bunch of on-device testing APIs out there. There's one that I'm particularly fond of. It's a company called AppThwack. I'm happy to spell that for you guys later on. But they basically have an API with a whole bunch of devices behind it. So some of these more complex things, like you're talking about rotating a device, for example, to see what happens, you can do that sort of thing. These are actually real physical devices, and they can kind of simulate that. So there are ways to automate some of these even more complex things that you can probably only do on a real physical device. Does that make sense? Okay. Cool. I've got 2 minutes left.
We've got time for the last question. And the last question. Okay, you can catch Kevin later during the break, or probably at the after party. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you.
Give him a lot of applause.
All right. Thank you, guys.